So John said when he began the session that all his experiments or enterprises in art and science have been failures. But I'm going to tell you about a scientific project that I've been working on for about 2 years, which is actually about art and science and owes its genesis directly to John. So, as you may know, John Brockman knows everybody. And every year, Uber agent Brockman blasts into town and has a dinner. And if you're lucky enough to be invited to that dinner, you just don't know who you might meet. Terry Gilliam might be there. Craig Venter, the guy who sequenced the human genome. All kinds of, any major publisher will be there. And occasionally, I'm lucky enough to be invited. 2 years ago, I was at one of these dinners, and a small, bald man came and sat down next to me. And we introduced ourselves. I said, I'm Armand Leroi, I'm an evolutionary biologist. And he said, I'm Brian Eno, I'm a musician. And we began talking, as you do, about evolution and music. And then we began talking about the evolution of music. And in particular, we began asking the question, has anybody attempted to reconstruct the history of human song? People all over the world sing in very different ways. Is it possible to retrieve that history? And when I mean retrieve that history, what I mean is to do for song what we have done for genes. Let me give you an example of what I mean. This is a phylogeny. It's a map showing the emergence of people from out of Africa, around the world, as reconstructed by looking at our genes, at mitochondrial DNA. Now, in the same ways, you can build an evolutionary tree doing this, using genes. You can build an evolutionary tree on the basis of language. So, since the 19th century, philologists have been reconstructing the history of languages by looking at how they diverge from each other. And this is a tree of the Indo-European language. What about song? Could you do something similar for music? Eno said to me, well, I don't know much about this except for one thing. He said, have you ever heard of a guy called Alan Lomax? I said, no. Lomax, Brian went on to explain, was an American musicologist. He's famous for having collected songs in the Deep South in the 1940s, along with his father, who was also a musicologist. And in fact, many of you will be familiar with that, with their songs. If you know, there's a Moby song, I forget its name, which samples some Deep South music. That was collected by Lomax originally. If you've seen the Coen Brothers film, O Brother, Where Art Thou, with all those wonderful songs in there, that was all collected by Alan Lomax. Now, unusually, for a folk song collector, however, Lomax had a strongly analytical bent of mind. And he believed that you could actually quantify music. And he invented a system which he called cantometrics, which is essentially a way of describing songs. And he got $1 million from the National Institutes of Mental Health in the 1960s and set up a research project in which he attempted to quantify the properties of something like 5,000 songs from 800 cultures. And then he took all this data and he put it into a big computer, and this is the 1960s, so it was a big computer. And he tried to reconstruct the history of human song. Eno said to me, what do you think? He said, it's really interesting, but I don't understand the statistics. So I said I would take a look at it. And frankly, when I looked at them, I didn't understand them either. But I thought, the data are absolutely wonderful. I went to New York, I got the data, and we've been working on this for the last 2 years. And what I want to tell you is about what we found. So this is the book that Lomax published in 1968, and it's called Folk Song Style and Culture. And you might have expected to have revolutionized musicology, but it didn't. The musicologists hate it. I think it's because they don't understand numbers. And this is actually what the data set looked like. So there are 5,189 songs, 801 cultures, and these songs are described in terms of this performance properties. Not the melody, not the text, but rather how people sing. Do they sing with an open voice, or do they sing through their noses? Do they sing with very narrow intervals, or do they go and so on and so forth? Do they sing do they have rhythms? If so, what kind of rhythms? Do they sing in groups, and so on and so forth? And this is actually what some of the data look like. These are the data color-coded for 39 pygmy songs. And the thing that will strike you when you look, so it's variables going across, songs going down this way, it's just that it's incredibly variable, these songs. It's actually very difficult to find order. And to do that, we actually invented a new algorithm, which we call grouper. It's a computer algorithm, which essentially searches for order in cantometric space. Now, cantometric space, song space, is a very big and complicated place. And it's not easy to map its topography. Just to give you a sense of the computational problem, in order to do one run of grouper, we have a farm of 30 processors at Imperial in the bioinformatics unit, 30 processors which we run for 24 hours. So in other words, it would take you a month to do this, one set of analyses on your PC. That gives you a sense of just how hard it is to map out this space. But what we discovered is that what grouper does essentially is grouper divides this cantometric space into clusters, each cluster of which represents a song style. And then we asked, where do those song styles actually occur? And what we found is that each of them is located in some particular part of the world. So you can see it in these colors over here. So yellow over here is the yellow cluster, turns out to be entirely in Africa. The red cluster turns out to be in North America. There's a blue cluster up there in Europe, and so on and so forth. Now, that need not have been that way. It could have been the case that the way the clusters, they need not have been geographic. They could have been, they could have been functional. They could have been to do with work songs or happy songs, or sad songs, or anything. But it just so happens that it turns out that the big signal that we discovered is, in fact, geography. And where you've got geography, you've got history. Let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. If these songs show these distributions, it seems to us that they must be pretty old. Now, this is the Africa distribution over here, and this is just a fancy way of mapping it using geographical information software to get these contours, but it's the same data. Now, we can say, what do those songs sound like, those ones that are in Africa? And it turns out that they all have a very distinctive style. They have a kind of, there's a very specific kind of polyphony in which they sing, in which people sing in a very smooth, blended polyphony in a kind of a call and response way, and very, very striking polyrhythms. Now, we can detect this statistically, but what you really want to do is you just want to listen to them. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's see if I can just get this. There we go. Use the trackpad. Do you hear it? It's that call and response, call and response. Okay, that's Zulu. Swazi. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely characteristic of all of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa. Why is it characteristic of Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, there's one obvious explanation. If you look at the mapping of where you find this song style, it's amazingly coincident with other patterns in the history of Africa, specifically the archaeology, the distribution of languages, and everything we know about sub-Saharan African history. This is the song style map. This is the genetic map over here. You can actually see the distribution of genes and how they divide up Africa. Why is it? If you look at over there, that's the history of the Bantu migration. 2,700 years ago, a group of people left northwest Africa, somewhere in the vicinity of the Cameroons, migrated down. They were the Bantu-speaking people, and on the top right, you can see the distribution of the Bantu-speaking language. Now, the best explanation then for the distribution of the song style is that what we are looking at here is a song style that was laid down approximately 2,500 years ago. And that's the legacy of that migration that we're actually looking at. And to give you a sense of just how conserved song styles can be, listen to this one and compare it to what you've just heard. It's a song called Rosie, and it's sung in perfect call and response mode by a group of African American men in the 1940s working on a chain gang in Alabama. It's a completely African song which has survived hundreds of years of separation from Africa, immense cultural diffusion and differences, and yet it remains that intrinsically African style. What about the rest of the world? If we look around the rest of the world, we can find that actually song styles may be even much more ancient than that. This is the Americas. There's a purple cluster down here, which is South America, going up here, and even a little bit in Asia. There's a red cluster up here. You can see it on these maps as well. How can we explain that? Take a look back here. The really striking thing about this cluster, the striking thing about the top cluster, the bottom cluster, is that you also see it around circumarctic Asia. What's the best explanation for that? The explanation that we think is that this song are song styles that came over from Asia with the invasion of the very first human beings into the Americas around 1,400 years ago. And again, you can just hear it if you listen to the songs. What you're going to hear now is an Inuit song. It's not very entertaining. It's just a man sitting on an ice floe, groaning to himself. And this can go on for hours, but we won't. Okay, now we're going to go to right to the other side of the continent. We're going to go to Patagonia, and we're going to hear. And we're going to hear a man sitting on a rock, basically groaning to himself. And this too can go on for hours. It's again that very low, guttural, restricted interval style. And now. We're in Hokkaido. We're listening to an Innu man sitting on a rock, groaning to himself. These styles, I think, are ancient. I think that we are listening to songs that may be 14,000 years old. Here, what about Northern Europe? Well, Europe turns out to be musically very, very complicated. But there's a very striking style which is found in Northern Europe. And this is what it sounds like. It's that blue cluster up there. It's a solitary, very wordy style, solo a cappella. It's gorgeous. If you were to listen to this, I think, as I did when I first heard this, I said, you know, this is just Celtic music. It's Irish or something. It's not. Nothing to do with the Celtic fringe. What we call the Celtic fringe is, in fact, Norwegian. It's Scandinavian. This is a Norwegian lullaby. And in fact, that's what Irish music is really about. It's probably a legacy of the Vikings. What about the rest of the world? One of the really striking things we found is that is that there's a pattern of songs which run from east to west right across Eurasia. And you can see it over here. It starts over here in Indonesia, stretches right across Asia to the Saudi Arabia Peninsula, North Africa, and goes up into southern Spain. We were puzzled by this because one of the things about this particular pattern is that, unlike all the other patterns that we see, it's very hard to interpret it in terms of genes. If you look at the distribution of how the world is divided up, humans are divided up in terms of genes, the genetic topography, what you find is that there's always a split between East and West. There's always a bit of confusion in there in the middle, in the vicinity of India, but otherwise there's a split. What's the explanation for it? Well, the explanation is that if there's a discordance between genes and culture, we must be looking for a cultural effect that is independent of people moving, but it's just cultures being imposed upon people with very little migration, hegemonic culture. And the best explanation that we've got for this pattern is that what we're looking at is the hand of Islam. The distribution, it matches perfectly the distribution of the Islamic Empire, which around 1300, which goes from the sultanates of Indonesia across Europe right through to Andalusia. And you can hear that if you just listen to the songs. This is an Azerbaijani shepherd sitting on a hillside singing to a sheep. But it's not only the hand of Islam that we're listening to in our music and that influences so much of Southern Europe's music. It's also possibly other styles, other influences. Wait for the singing. Now, I don't know what that sounds like to you, but to me, that's pure Bollywood. But it isn't. It turns out to be, in fact, a Macedonian gypsy song. And it just shows you how these musical styles can travel. One of the greatest, most fascinating, coolest results that we found is that if you go to Africa, in this big swathe of song and music that is the sub-Saharan Bantu expansion, that call and response, that smooth polyphony, there are embedded in it some islands of another kind of music. And they're found here, over here in the Kalahari, up there in the West Congo, East Congo, and up there in the West Congo. And it turns out that they are sung by pygmies and bushmen, or Kung or San as they're more politely known. It's a wonderful song style, and what's so strange about it is that it is sung by people who are very, very far apart from each other. These people down here live thousands of miles away from these people up here, pygmies and bushmen, and there's no connection between them whatsoever, except that they are both relict populations who live as hunter-gatherers. And yet, if you actually listen to their songs, they're remarkably similar. Both of them, and this is going to be a Kung Bushman group. They have an intricate, interlocking polyphony. Beautifully counterpointed. It's absolutely distinctive, completely different from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And now, listen to the pygmies. Again, it's that same beautiful, interlocked, interweaving polyphony. What do we think is going on here? One explanation, and it seems like the best one, is that what we are listening to is the remnants of an extinct song culture, musical culture. One that at one time was widespread right across Africa, but that essentially became extinguished or thrown into small relict populations by the spread of the Bantu agriculturists and their expansion around 2,500 years ago, who came sweeping down from the north and pushed these hunter-gatherers into these little enclaves where they've been singing the same songs ever since. But there's even a more provocative possibility. If you actually take a look at our DNA, people from around the world, and you construct an evolutionary tree, the one thing that the San of the Kalahari and the Pygmies have in common is that they are the very first people to branch off from the human evolutionary tree. And all the different kinds of data, here are 3 evolutionary trees, they all show exactly the same thing. Here is San Bushmen branching off, there are your Pygmies, there are some other Pygmies, and there is everybody else in the world. It seems that they are the very founders of our species. And if that's true, and that is true, it is possible that we could be, when we listen to their intricate polyphonic melodies, it could be that we are listening to the oldest songs of all humanity. It could be that we are actually listening to the Song of Songs. Thanks.